at this time I asked him, I said, Dr. Erickson, can I please sit in while you're seeing a patient? Can I watch you do therapy? He was seeing a few patients then. And he said, no. He said, these are not teaching patients, these are not clinic patients, these are private practice patients, it's not appropriate. No problem. So he's seeing a patient, and I go to rest in the little house, and actually I fall asleep and I'm taking a nap, and suddenly there's a knock on the door that wakes me up, and I come to the door, and there's this stunning woman, and she looks like the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine. She's just dressed impeccably and beautiful makeup, and she's a stunning looking woman, and she says, Dr. Erickson wants to see you. And she must have been the patient. So I say, okay, I'll be right there, and I come in, and she's seated in the green chair, and seemingly a little nervous, and I'm certainly nervous, and I don't exactly understand what I'm doing there. And as I remember, Erickson says to me, Jeff, this is Kathy, fictitious name, and Kathy said that she wore her sunglasses to protect herself against the hostile world. And the sunglasses are on a little table that's in between the two chairs where we're seated. And Erickson says, but I said to her, you don't need those sunglasses in here with me. And Erickson says, Kathy, this is Jeff Zeig, and he's a therapist from California. And she says, oh, a student? And he says, no, a therapist. And then Erickson looks at me and he says, isn't she pretty? And I say, well, yeah. And doesn't she have beautiful eyes? And I say, well, yeah. And doesn't she have lovely lips? And I say, well, and aren't her lips kissable? And suddenly I start to sweat. And I'm thinking, am I the patient? Is she the patient? Am I in a trance? Is she in a trance? Who's getting therapy here? What's happening? And Erickson, who is confined to, his wheelchair, his office chair, and he's getting animated, and doesn't she dress beautifully? And doesn't she have lovely legs? And wouldn't she be a good friend to your cousin? And wouldn't she be a good friend to my daughter? And this is going on. And I am, looking at her and saying, yeah. And suddenly, like a magic trick, Dr. Erickson disappears. Well, he had a buzzer underneath his desk, an emergency buzzer that he could signal Mrs. Erickson. And so he must have pressed that buzzer when I was not looking, and Mrs. Erickson knew to come in immediately that there must be an emergency. So she came in, moved Dr. Erickson to his wheelchair, whisked him into the main house, and I'm left alone with Kathy. And I say goodbye to her, and she leaves, and then a little bit later there's a knock on the door, and it's Kathy again. And she says, I forgot my sunglasses. And there were her sunglasses, and they were still there on the table, and she hadn't picked them up. And so I give her sunglasses, and I'm walking around Dr. Erickson's office trying to make sense of this and trying to think, what did all of this mean and what was it about? And finally I decide I'm going to talk to Dr. Erickson. I didn't like to disturb him once he went into the main house because he didn't have so many hours in which he could speak and he needed time to rest. And so I knock on the door. I ask Mrs. Erickson, can I see Dr. Erickson? And she says, of course. And she asks him, and he says, of course. And then I go in and I say to Dr. Erickson, blurting it out, Kathy forgot her sunglasses. And he just nods. And I said, you expected that? And he just nods. And I said, you set it up? And he just nods. And I said, how did you do it? And he said, well, she told me she needed her sunglasses to protect herself against the hostile world. I said, you don't need them in here with me. And then he said that he told her stories, and some of them were boring stories. Like how a woman could go shopping and she could go to one store and she could purchase something and then go to a second store and be looking for something and find something that she really liked, and then she'd go to a third store and not be sure about what she bought whether or not she should buy what she saw at the second store, and suddenly she realizes she left something behind at the first store, and he would glance at the sunglasses suggestively as he would intersperse this idea of forgetting. And then he said to me, in reference to her forgetting the sunglasses, Jeff, she's starting to believe in me. And that was an important moment in my understanding hypnosis, that an essential aspect of hypnosis is developing responsiveness to the implicit nature of the message. And that when people start responding to the implicit nature of the message, it's at that moment that we can really say that hypnosis exists. And that's my definition. Other experts would have different definitions of hypnosis. And then Erickson told me the story about Kathy, that Kathy grew up in this family with an aunt and a mother who were disparaging of her femininity. And so Kathy dressed in this hyper-feminine way to emphasize her femininity, feeling an underlying insecurity about her femininity. So Erickson wanted to do some ego building. Well, if he would have given her a compliment, she rejected it. You know, Kathy had a tendency to put down, like her aunt and her mother, oh, he's a student. And so Erickson had a young man. So if you have a young man, what are you going to do? You utilize him. So he utilized me. And I gave compliments to Kathy, but I wasn't giving compliments to Kathy. Erickson was giving the compliments, but Erickson wasn't giving the compliments. I wasn't giving the compliments. So it was very hard for Kathy to discount. And in the process, I learned something very valuable about my ability to withstand pressure. And this was also part of Erickson. He, would push and push and push and help you to understand that you may have created some artificial limits inside yourself, and that by living through those limits, you reclaim your power. So that has been a very important story to me, and has also helped me to understand something about hypnotic amnesia and the mechanisms by which people respond without being aware of the stimulus that led to the response. And subsequently, I've used a very similar technique with patients to demonstrate that I could do that, and that they would respond, and that they would believe in me.